let's get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Email, Communication, or Records. Next slide, please, Jeff. My name's Rick Wilson. I'm a product manager here at Gimel, and I'm joined today by our key speaker, Gimel Solutions Architect, Jeff Tuish. That word didn't want to come out too well. Next slide, Jeff. Just a couple of housekeeping items to cover before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many of those as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There'll be at least one poll question that you'll see pop up on a separate screen, so please keep an eye out for that. And as a reminder, all responses to the poll are anonymous. As always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. And we will be recording today's session. All right, so to kick things off, just a couple of slides here to tell you a bit about Gimel and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Gimel is an information governance software company that was founded in 2002. Our mission is to help you achieve your information governance goals by providing solutions that balance the value of your information against the risk that it also presents. Whether you're trying to manage information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimel can help you achieve those goals. We have a client success team and a global network of partners to help deliver solutions in conjunction with our key vendor partners like Microsoft and SAP. On this slide, you'll see Gimel's family of software products. They work together to help you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migration from legacy systems, file analysis and e-discovery, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP content. Well, with that started, I'm going to hand the floor over to Jeff so he can get started on today's content. All yours, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Okay, we're going to start off with a poll question. So just curious, what is the current state of your company's email retention policy enforcement? So as you're filling this out and answering that, I thought I'd let you know this is the second of three series of webinars we'll be doing. The first one we did last month regarding file shares. This one is regarding email. And then the next one will be regarding SharePoint. So we'll be talking about the various types of unstructured data and how we can manage it. And once again, this one is specific to email. All right, I'm going to jump into, okay, there's some good stats. So we see pretty even distribution of people with no policy currently, 37%, created but not enforced, 23%, and active, 40%. Great, thanks for answering those questions, guys. All right, so let's jump into it. Okay, so this is the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to talk about unstructured data, do a brief overview of that, go into the risks and costs, the challenges and the process chronology. Those are going to be together. So I'll be talking about how we can go through and properly manage the email, some of the challenges regarding that. And then lastly, how Gimel can help with both your email and your records management. Okay, so what is unstructured data? Well, it's any set of data that does not fit a schema or preset data model. So it's just data living in various repositories that has no structure whatsoever with it. So what types are we talking about? Well, I broke it down into three different categories. Email, regardless of the vendor. Instant messaging, same as well, regardless of the vendor. And then lastly, storage. So these are the three main repositories for unstructured data. And I have some slides coming up here that will give you some insight as to why you should be concerned about your unstructured data. So first off, this first slide, 80% of all data by 2025 will be unstructured. That should give you pause. That means that the unstructured data is not going away. In fact, as you can see, the opposite is true. It is going to continue to grow. In the middle graphic, we see that 80% of companies are not satisfied with their unstructured data performance. So a question I have for you, do you think you're doing everything you can to help manage your unstructured data, regardless of any of those buckets where it lives? And then lastly, this is probably the most daunting of all, unstructured data is growing by 50% each year. Once again, it is not going away. Now is the time. If you don't have any way of managing your unstructured data, now is the time, because the amount of data is not going to get any smaller. So what's in your unstructured data? Well, I broke it down into 6 different categories. These are just mine that I have put together here for all 3 of these webinars. First, talking about ROT. If that's a new term to you, you'll see what the acronym stands for here. Redundant are things duplicates, whether it's duplicate files on a file share or in SharePoint, or duplicate emails because multiple people on the recipients list. You have duplicates sitting out there in your unstructured data. Age data is things that is no longer needed. You have, once again, files, emails, whatever it might be, that have reached their life cycle but have not yet been disposed. Then trivial data, things like picture of your kids. We all send emails or post files that are not business related, but that does take up space as well. We get into the privileged environment. Now we're talking acquisitions, divestments and legal. And then proprietary, you'll see the 3 that I made up, just examples for that. Keep in mind that, so talking about email, highly recommend the only instance of privileged and proprietary data should not be in email only. That's not the only place to keep that. And we're going to talk about that as we go. And then 4 through 6, sensitive data, things like contracts and HIPAA, anything to do with information that's sensitive. And that actually rolls in as well with personal identifiable. So those of you who have heard the terms or even dealing with it now, GDPR, CCPA, that is the Privacy Act out of California. GDPR is for Europe. There's also other ones. I believe the state of Colorado and Virginia have both passed privacy laws. And there are many other states that have privacy laws in legislation that you're going to have to be able to go through and do the personal identifiable and make sure that data is clean, as well as being able to reply to what are called DSAR requests, direct subject access requests, when a person says, what information do you have on me in the company? So it's very important that you get your arms around the personal identifiable. And then lastly, the only bucket I have left is business information. So just basic information that doesn't fit into the other categories fall into business information. So all these would probably be dealt in a different kind of way. And we're going to talk about what makes up an email, as the webinar name suggested, what's communication and what is a record. So what are some of the risks? Well, there's a risk of evidence being lost. If you have emails in your environment, and this goes for any unstructured data, that is helping with litigation, then the risk of that being deleted by a user unknowingly is a problem. So you want to make sure you're protecting that. The sensitive and PII data, once again, making sure that this information is not becoming propagated out in other areas. Data leakage. I have a great example of that. I actually was working a little bit with a company, and somehow they kept my email address and they started sending me things that was not for my eyes. So data leakage, it could be an unintentional email being sent out or forwarded from somebody that has any of those types of data, proprietary, what have you, within it. Storages and backups, if you have on-prem anything, then obviously that's a risk having that there. We've all seen the ransomware and everything else that's happening within our environment anymore. And then size limits on cloud, if you be paying extra money because of size limits that you have maxed out. Some of the other costs, fines and lawsuits, those are big. If you ever have Googled lawsuits for unstructured data, look at GDPR fines. These are not rounding errors. These are very large amounts that companies have had to pay due to not being compliant with fines and or lawsuits. Same with the privacy laws, the same kind of thing comes into play there. And then storage in the cloud as well could also be costing you additional money because you're not managing your unstructured data. This is why I want to spend a lot of time on today. So the processes, so the challenges and the processes that were on the agenda, they pretty much go hand in hand here. So what I'm talking about is the ability to actually classify. Now, this is an optional step. You don't have to do it. I recommend it. But it basically, what and I'll be talking about it, is being able to discern what type of message is it. Is it proprietary? Is it privileged? Is it sensitive? Is it ROT? So be able to go out there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of how to determine that. And then creating records or enforced retention. So what I'm looking at on this is, maybe this is too binary, but I'm saying that an email is either a record or it's retention enforceable, meaning that it can be deleted after a certain amount of time. Now, a record could be as well, but the way that you delete records, I would recommend be different than the way you're enforcing retention on email. And then lastly, manage records. And that is working in conjunction, obviously, with create records, that how you would disposition records that are now in a centralized location instead of sitting in somebody's mailbox. So let's dive into each one of these. Okay, so classifying a message. And what I mean by that is, with our Gimel Discover product, we have the ability to actually go out using any of the criteria that you see here: content, the addresses, sender, recipients, domains, what folder a message is in, any of the properties or values of a message, like the subject or the message class and message type. Any of those can be used to be able to say, okay, I want to classify this message. So this could be with content, which is most typical. It would be keywords, phrases, regex. For those of you who are not familiar with regex, it stands for regular expressions, and that helps you find patterns like social security numbers and credit cards, what have you. So that would allow you then to go through and classify messages. So what's the benefit of classifying your messages? This is all the heavy lifting. So this is why I like doing this up front. And what I mean by that is, if we can go through your emails and classify them, and now I'm not saying classify every message, but only classify the ones that you think are worthy of a classification. If it's picture of the kids, leave it unclassified. But for things that are privileged or proprietary or need to become a record, definitely classify them. So I'll give you an example how to pull that off. And first off, it's daunting. It's not easy to do this. It's not going to be done in a week. But as we saw with the unstructured data in its growth, it's not going to get any easier or smaller. So one of the things we're doing with some clients is going out and saying, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to set up a iterative and perpetual process to go through your historical emails first. So let's start off with anything more than 20 years old. Somebody's had the same email system or have migrated messages from previous email systems, and we want to go out and find all of those older than 20 years. Let's classify those. And then we go down to 19 years and 18. And once again, you see that progression that we're taking. Once we get down to the current date, now we flip it. So instead of going after things older than a certain number of days, we're going to say, I want to classify things that are only younger than a certain number of days. Because looking at this, everything historical is already done. What we want to do now are all new emails. So this will be a much smaller set of data that it has to process, but it'll be constantly going through and looking to see what has been classified. So that's the classification. So once again, that is a iterative and perpetual process to get everything on board. And the reason we like classifying is because now we can use that in both the creation of the records as well as the enforcement of the retention to be able to use this classification. But once again, that is an optional step. So let's say that you don't want to go through and classify, then we want to be able to find records. So once again, using that same kind of criteria, being able to use regular expressions or keywords, phrases, addresses, folder, whatever it might be allowed to go out and identify emails that are records. So you have two ways of doing that, either via a user. So a user going, I believe this is a record, and I'm going to export or save that message as a different type. So you can actually save a message, for instance, in Microsoft Exchange, you can save it as an MSG file. And what you could then do is have it be consumed by your record system. And now you're managing the email as a record instead of sitting in somebody's mailbox. Because the isolation that you have in mailboxes, obviously, most people only have access to their own, and you can't share that information. That's the whole point of records, is to have it someplace in a central repository. Now, you're also going to notice I have a thing called RepStore down here under user. That is a piece of software that Gimel sells. We do not make it. But what it does is it allows the user to be able to drag a message from their 365 account, for instance, into SharePoint directly. They don't have to export it or save it as an MSG. They can put it into SharePoint directly, and then hopefully your record system would pick that up and then start processing it and dispositioning it. So that's a method of doing that. Or if you have a way of saving these messages based upon your criteria, instead of encumbering the user with doing that, you could actually go out and automate that process, create those MSG files based upon, most likely, again, content, and be able to have those as records. Now, keep in mind, if we actually had assigned labels and we decided to do classification, I could use those labels as part of my criteria for the records as well. Moving on to enforcement of retention. Now, this is something I've been helping companies with for 20 plus years. And basically what we're trying to talk about here is being able to go out and say, okay, how old is too old for a message? Well, obviously you have regulations that you have to deal with depending on what vertical market you're in. I'm sure you have legal ones as well. So making sure you're compliant with those. But some of the criteria that people are using to enforce retention are, what folder is it in? For instance, Exchange again. Is it in the inbox or sent items or a personal folder or the calendar? So using that folder criteria to be able to say, which ones do I want to and not want to enforce? Age is actually the most common thing that I've seen over the years being used for doing that enforcement. So for instance, anything older than 90 days in the inbox, we're going to delete it out of the user's inbox. We're going to remove the message from their mailbox. And I'll be talking a little bit about that coming up here shortly in methodology. Addresses, once again, senders, recipients, domain. We have the content again. And then some things to help people not be processed. Maybe you want to look at their out of office status. If somebody's out of the office, possibly you would want to skip them and not process them until they return. Or we have exclusions. So exclusions meaning a lot of times when I see retention policies being made, they're not always followed by everyone. A lot of times the C-suite and legal will have either different retentions, most likely longer than the typical user would, or they might be excluded altogether from the processing. So just keep all these things in mind when you're going through and creating your policies to be able to understand exactly what you need to conform with from a political, cultural, legal aspect, as well as the criteria you can use. Now, methodology-wise, you could be user empowered. You could actually allow the user to say, well, I only want messages that live in particular folders to be processed. So now the user has the ability, by moving them out of a folder like the inbox, they can actually protect that message from being processed. And we have had many clients over the years that have done that. They only process inbox and sent, and they leave everything else alone. Now, the problem is with that is, guess what the users are going to do? They're going to take everything out of inbox and sent and put it into a personal folder, and now no retention's happening. So be wary of empowering the users, because they will take advantage of those loopholes. Stages. We have both single and multi-stage. Single stage typically being, okay, I've told my users that we have a legal policy. Anything older than 180 days in the inbox is going to be deleted. That is the only time I'm telling you. So we have seen that happen. We also have seen that the cultural way of doing it is to notify the users what's going to be deleted prior to it being deleted, and that fits in with notification. And then later on, having a process that goes out and deletes what it told them it was going to delete. So maybe it gives the user a chance to intervene and protect some messages if no need being. But the notification is ironic when you think about it. This is actually an email notification. So we're going to be sending an email telling you that you need to clean up your email. So use that. A lot of companies aren't doing this anymore, but it is an option that I would encourage you to use, whatever system you're using. And the schedule, when should the policies run and how often should they run? Once a month, once a week? What's your throughput? What's your pain point on enforcing the retention? And then lastly, managing things as records. If you decided to have an email be your record, then let's go through and the different things that would happen in true records management. We're going to assign that record a classification. We're going to manage the legal holds. Now, I'm not talking about legal holds on a mailbox in 365. I'm talking about particular records actually being on legal hold. Disposition of records after they reach their life cycle, then being able to go out and either delete them or archive them, whatever action you want to take. Having that full audit trail, obviously inside of a mailbox is not a great chain of custody, but having a full audit trail is in your record system to be able to provide that. And then lastly, destruction certificates. When you are disposing records based upon reaching their threshold of age, then you have the ability to, hopefully within your record system, create destruction certificates to be able to say, yes, we did have that record, but it no longer exists, and this is when it was destroyed. Okay, so what I have for you here, the last few slides, is an email rot analysis. So if legal is coming to you saying, we need to enforce a retention policy on email, then typically they're going to be following the regulations and rules of which they have to comply. So I totally get that. However, we've also seen many a customer over the couple of decades that are being driven, the email retention is being driven by IT. And if that's the case, then if they have legal's blessing, of course, then they go through and try to understand what are the implications of going out and performing an analysis on the mailboxes to get an understanding of how many messages would be affected if I were to pull the trigger and start deleting based upon how old things are. So in this case, I'm just going from top to bottom, you're going the age of the message, just to get an understanding of how much data do I have. So this is the old measure twice, cut once thing. Always analyze again. Maybe it's measure 20 times, cut once, honestly, before you're ready to actually take that final action to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing and what's going to be affected. But maybe emails might be records. So you'll see here that I have 3 different emails that have different subjects on them and how they could be handled. So pretend, if you will, I actually created, which I did, MSG files from these 3 messages. And now what they did is I put them onto a file share and they were ingested into our Gimel Records product. And you're going to notice the highlighted areas. Those are the MSG files. And the subject is actually the name of the file itself. But I want to draw your attention to the right of the title is the record class. Notice that there's a different record class for each one of those. So based upon their content, their label, whatever criteria, once again, you want to use, then you could have that record class be assigned. And then down near the bottom, you'll see the life cycle in each one of these, and notice those as well. So here is that disposition I'm talking about, being able to have messages reach their age and then be dispositioned by your records management system as opposed to being done by an email policy. So in summary, determine and apply your classifications, determine and save your records, make sure you save those things, get them out of email. That shouldn't be the only place they live. Create and enforce your retention on the remaining messages, and then manage those records properly within your records management system. So once again, as I said at the beginning, this is the 3rd segment in a series of 3. The first one I did was managing chaos and file shares last month. Today is email, and then next month will be SharePoint. So that concludes the webinar on email communication or records.
Thanks so much, Jeff. A lot of great content in that presentation, and we've got a number of audience questions that we can address in just a minute, but we would like to ask if any of you would like to learn more about the Gimel products through this poll. Okay, well, that's wrapping up. Let me move over to some Q&A. Jeff, a lot of interest in the audience for various aspects of your presentation here. Awesome. So let's start with this. So this is probably a simple one. Somebody asked the slide that had the statistics on it early in your presentation where you said 80% of data will be unstructured by 2025. Do you have a citation for that? A source?
I can try to find I will find that source on that.
Okay.
I don't have it on the top of my head. I'm sorry. I don't remember where I got that.
It's fine. Michael will let you know if we locate that. The next question, how do you govern that the user is not just classifying every email as a record?
Well, that's a good question. So that's why it might be better to use the automated method. No offense to the users, but for them to make that decision on what's a record and what isn't is a scary, frightening thing, quite honestly, because you're empowering them to make those decisions. So I would definitely encourage you to do it a different way. So here's some of the things you can do. So you can actually go through the users' mailboxes using, for instance, our Gimel Discover product and extract the messages that match your criteria to become records and then possibly either put them into a PST file that's on premises or another mailbox, and then take the information in that mailbox and have those messages become records.
Oh, good thinking, Jeff. Next question. Can you do classification via semantic analysis, similar to what Microsoft Viva does when analyzing communications? For example, queue up any message containing a mutual commitment to a change of company state. That statement for further review.
I'm not quite sure if I understand that fully. So Rick, if you could make a note of who that was, and then we will get back with them.
Okay, yeah, happy to do that for you, Jeff. And actually, this is from the same party. How do you recommend implementing restrictions that prevent users from hiding their cheese within Outlook?
Hiding their cheese.
Great, I love that book. Yeah, Who Moved My Cheese?
This has been a common problem ever since I've been working with email, of users finding a way to get around things. Once again, we have many clients that only go after the stock folders in Exchange, for instance, and they leave everything else alone, which basically allows the user to totally get around things. We've also even seen users go through and send emails back to themselves to get around the problem. I mean, there is no foolproof way of doing it, but I would say that you need to manage all the folders in the email, and also get an understanding. If you see all of a sudden that there's emails to and from that user, then you know they're playing games, and probably need a little explanation on not to do that anymore.
Fair enough. Thanks, Jeff. Next question. If you notify users that some emails will be deleted, how can they mark some emails as exceptions? For example, how do they exclude them from that deletion process?
Great question. So one of the things we typically see, and it's once again, that two-stage or that multi-stage process I talked about, is, for instance, on the first and third Saturdays of the month, to go through and analyze the mailboxes and move the messages that are going to be deletion candidates into a to be deleted folder, while under that folder maintaining the original structure where the message lived. And now when we do on the second and fourth weeks, you have two choices. You can either go through and say, I'm only going to manage the messages in to be deleted. So basically empowering the user with the ability to take things out of that folder structure so they won't be deleted. Or you just say, look, I was just telling you to be nice, I'm still going to delete it. So you have the choice either way of doing that, but you can empower the users. But once again, I would encourage caution with that, because any loophole you give them, they're going to leverage fully.
Great. And you actually may have answered this during the course of your presentation, Jeff, but we'll throw it back out for everybody again. What is the file format of the classified and saved email when it becomes a record? Is it creating a copy while the original remains in Exchange?
Yes, that's exactly what it's doing. So that way you could actually enforce the retention policy on those, but at the same time, make sure that you have a record of it. Now, if you do an Exchange, I can't speak to every email system and how it would be saved, but if you do an Exchange, it's going to be an MSG file.
Okay, yeah, I thought you mentioned .msgs in your slides there. So this is the next audience question. Many financial services firms use third-party email archive tools that basically capture all communications. Those tools have some retention/disposition capabilities, but they're seldom used. Does Gimel have any capability to extend disposition policies into such third-party archives?
Well, it depends on what those third parties are. I mean, if they're just another mailbox in Exchange, yes. If they are other ones, we'd have to do that on a case-by-case basis and examine the possibility of doing that.
Yeah, they happen to mention Forrester, but I don't know if that's the financial services form or the third-party email archive. So
right.
Okay. So next question, Jeff, when classifying, how can you mitigate the false positives?
Oh boy, good question. So that's specifically going to be to a couple things. First off, I've seen content searches for keywords and expressions that are not very specific in the terms. Don't use common words. you're just going to get way too many hits on them. So be specific, but not overly specific. So I know that's a fine line to walk, but make sure that you know all your phrases. Now, we're talking about regex, that's a whole different animal. So for instance, with credit cards, I like to take a four-pronged approach to verifying a credit card number or a social insurance number out of Canada, because they both offer Loon algorithm as a way of making sure that it truly is a value. So with regex, you have that pattern, but I would encourage you not just to look for the pattern, but to also be able to know what valid values are allowed in that pattern. So for instance, a social security number can't have any one of the three components all zero. It also can't start with 666. It also, a social security number can't start with 8 or 9 because they haven't released those yet. Those are still being held back. So to be able to quantify and saying, okay, I know that this is not only fitting the pattern, but it's valid. But in addition to that, for like with credit cards and for socials, be able to look at the character immediately before the pattern match with regex and the one immediately after to make sure that, for instance, a number is not part of a larger pattern. So for instance, if a credit card had hyphens as your delimiter, then if you find a hyphen or a number directly before or after your pattern, you know it's part of a larger pattern, and that's a false positive. And then lastly, the other thing would be the Loon algorithm with credit cards and social insurance number. That's just a methodology that you can use. It does a checksum and making sure that the digits add, it's an algorithm that goes through checking the last digit of the social insurance number and the credit card against the other 13 or 14, 15, whatever the case might be.
Thanks, Jeff. We're going to sneak one more in, and if you can advance to the next slide, we'll get our email addresses up there for folks. So the last question we'll work in here, Jeff. What is a good rule of thumb for a general retention time frame for emails?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, obviously, your financial. I mean, I'm not up on all the laws at this point. I believe the last thing I heard is 7 years for financial. I'm sure manufacturing has theirs, as does pharmaceuticals and the life sciences. I have seen most commonly, if you're not following any kind of legal thing, anywhere from 90 to 90 days, that is, to a couple years. I mean, that's what we see typically for the inbox. I know that a lot of companies like to focus on the inbox and just get the users to move something if they won't, and just encourage them to do it. But yeah, it's the full gambit. Like I said during the webinar, I don't think I've ever seen any two companies have the exact same retention policy, because there's so many different permutations and things that can affect how the policy is defined.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So if you think of any other questions, our smiling faces are up there on the screen along with our email addresses. And if those are too hard to remember, if you can roll to the final screen, Jeff will have the email address, the general email address people can use, the info@gimbal.com. So for those of you who are interested in the recording, maybe you want to share it with a colleague or maybe revisit some of Jeff's excellent content, there'll be a thank you email being sent out within the next 24 to 48 hours. It'll have that recording link. It'll also be available on our website. Thanks again for attending today, and we hope you can join us for part 3 of the series, where Jeff will be discussing managing SharePoint items as records. Also, one other reminder, if you happen to be traveling to the ARMA conference in Houston later this month, please stop by the Gimbal booth and say hello. We'd love to see you. Have a good day, everyone.